Welcome to another episode on the Why I Love America podcast. As you can see, we've increased our budget and we have a new studio here in the judges' chambers. And so we're so grateful to Judge Stewart for allowing us to be here for the rest of the podcast, every episode, right?
Well, this is a rather unique thing to have a broadcast from a judge's chambers, I must confess.
Mm-hmm. And we're grateful for you having us. As a disclaimer as well, we always say this is not a political podcast. We only talk about the principles in which this great nation was founded upon. And as a judge, I mean, we couldn't think of a better person that has more experience talking about these principles and trying to refer back to them to find justice when it comes to the proceedings in which you deal with. So, Judge Stewart, I want to start off with a quote to start off this conversation, okay? I'm going to see if it's familiar to you, all right? So it goes like this. Today, it is common to criticize the founders of America. Judging them by today's standards of equality and justice, they do fail. Some owned slaves. None fought to give women equal rights. Most were wealthy white men. But there is just one problem with judging them by today's standards, and it is this. But for those imperfect founders and the sacrifices that they made and the instruments of government which they created, there would be no current enlightened standards of equality and justice to judge them by. What do you think about that quote? Is that would you agree with that?
Well, I would. Can I explain it?
Yeah, where did this quote come from? Is it familiar?
I taught classes at Utah State in political science for over 30 years. Mm-hmm. And probably 15 years ago, I began to see a change in my students. That the natural love for America that I had been raised with and that most of my generation and the next generation had was starting to not be as evident. And I saw it in my conversations with students, with questions they would ask me and so on. And at the beginning of each class thereafter, I actually gave a lecture on America and why I love America and why our Constitution is so important and so on. And in that lecture, I included that quote. Okay. And so for years and years, I used it, and I also used it in speeches when I had the opportunity to give it and so on. And ultimately, I decided I ought to prove it, and so I actually wrote a book to try to establish that what I have said is true, and I think I proved it, at least to myself.
Really? So, what is the name of that book?
A World Without America. What would your life be like if the American Revolution had failed?
Wow, that's an interesting premise to see what the world would be like. So let's dive into this. What did you find that proved this concept that if it weren't for the founding of America and for the founders, the equality and justice that we do see around the world wouldn't exist in the first place?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that in the long history of this world, what we have in America and have had for the last 200 years is absolutely unique. The history of the world is of tyrants, of czars and kings and emperors and so on. America was the first nation, other than some experimentation by the Greeks, in self-government, people governing themselves. And my brother Chris and I wrote books a decade or so ago where we talked about how God led world history to the establishment of this unique experiment in self-government that is the United States of America, and then also how God blessed America to be preserved during the last 200 some odd years. So I have a long history of understanding how unique this nation is, but I didn't understand until I did the research to justify my quote that if in fact the American Revolution had been lost by the rebels, if Great Britain had retained control of this continent, that the world would be a very different place. You and I and almost everyone else who lived here would either be a slave or would be slave owners. Slavery would never have been abolished in the world. What we take for granted are civil liberties, the sense of justice that we have in the court system and so on, that would never have come to be. America would have been settled in a very different way. You know, we have a huge amount of private ownership of our land in America. That was not true in Great Britain. Most of the land was owned by landed gentry, aristocracy. That would have been how America would have been settled. And those of us who would have farms or ranches would probably be tenants at will of a landed aristocracy, as has been England even up to this current time. Some have said, well, if the American Revolution had failed, that England would have evolved until where we are today. But I think I proved, at least to my own satisfaction, that that's not the case. That it was, in fact, the success of the American Revolution that resulted in an evolution towards civil liberties, the abolition of slavery, etc., that has happened in England. But even they were well behind where we evolved to. So
Interesting.
it's a rather labored expose, if you will, that I did. But as I said, I convinced myself that I was being honest in using that quote as I have through the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm. And I guess what would you say to someone that struggles with those facts that you mentioned or that are mentioned previously in that quote, that, you know, they did partake in things or the culture at the time was different, to where if you look at it with today's standards, a lot of people have a hard time seeing the greatness of the works that they did because of the things like slavery and whatnot. So what would you say to someone that struggles with overcoming those facts to see the beauty in the American founding?
That's a great question, Jackson. Let's take slavery, for example, all right? Slavery has existed everywhere since the beginning of time. There has never been a society or culture where slavery did not exist. There are international organizations that have suggested that there are probably 40 to 45 million people in slavery even today. It is a universally practiced horror, okay? So what brought about the abolition of slavery? Some have taken the view that it was Great Britain who led the way. They refer, for example, to William Wilberforce and in the great movie Amazing Grace.
Who's awesome. I love William Wilberforce.
Yeah, it's a great story. Well, I, in my research, reached the conclusion that if America had lost the American Revolution, that Great Britain would never have abolished slavery. That it was, in fact, America who set the path. Something we have to remember about our system is that it's a federalist system. Much of what has happened in the way of progress towards protecting our civil liberties and abolishing slavery happened in the states. Many people in America and the world view abolition of slavery happening at the end of the American Civil War in 1865. But the fact of the matter is that by 1804, 9 of the 13 colonies had already abolished slavery. They were the ones who set the pace.
Who led the way.
Who set the example. And even among states where slavery still existed, there was a massive amount of what's called manumission, which is individual slave owners ending slavery for their slaves. And it was because of the principles set forth in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. And slaves would come to their owners and say, hey, you just helped fight a civil war, a revolutionary war where you guided by the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Well, am I not a man? And some of those slave owners, even in those states where slavery was still legal, said yeah, and they allowed tens of thousands of slaves to go free. But again, in most of the colonies that had become states, slavery was abolished by 1804. And it was not until 1834 that England abolished slavery, and they only abolished slavery in the West Indies. Slavery was allowed in India until 1860, which was a British colony, if you will. It was something that's kind of interesting about it. When slavery was finally abolished in the West Indies, the British government paid the slave owners for the freedom of their slaves, basically bought the slaves. To do so, it took 40% of the budget of Great Britain in that year to purchase the freedom of the slaves in the West Indies.
Wow.
Okay, let's surmise a world where America had lost a revolution. Slavery was prevalent everywhere in America, not just in the southern states, but in the northern colonies, where there were millions upon millions of slaves still in America. The British government could never have had the money would never have had the money
buy
to
the
purchase their freedom. It would not have happened. And there was no motivation for the English to do it.
Interesting.
So that's just one of the examples I would give, and that's why I make the assertion that had it not been for the success of the American Revolution, the evolution of America in the way that it has to abolishing slavery and expanding civil rights to others, that we would live in a world where slavery still existed everywhere.
Wow. That's a really good argument. That's really interesting to think about, a world without the revolution having happened. What do you think is the secret sauce, though? What is it about that spark in early America that allowed for this amazing progress in civil liberties? What do you think that is?
Well, as I mentioned, my brother Chris and I wrote a book 15 years ago or so where we laid out a series of events in world history that resulted in this rather unique situation in Western Europe, in England in particular. It was primarily because of Christianity. Christianity brought a view of the world that was very unique among world religions, that focuses on the individual. Mm-hmm. Christianity teaches that we're responsible for our own sins, right? Mm-hmm. That's a sense of individuality that is unique among religions. That, along with the independence that came with those people who immigrated to America, primarily from Great Britain, that just led to a sense of equality and responsibility for the individual. And this idea of equality was very disturbing, even to the British. One of the reasons why I believe that America today, had the American Revolution failed, would be still class-based is because England, to a large extent, is still class-based, even after all these years. One of the things that disturbed the British about America and those people who led the rebellion was that they had this horrible sense of equality. And in the British Parliament, an example was given very early on at the outset of the American Revolution, where a member of Parliament said, I went to Boston and I knocked on the door, and a man answered the door, and I said, well, where's your master? And this man who answered the door said, I have no master. He said, I'm my own equal with the man who I work for. And the member of the British Parliament used that as an example of the horrific attitudes of American people.
Disgusting.
But that was unique in American culture. And again, I think the basis of it is Christianity, and it was allowed to flourish here in America.
Interesting. It's wild to me, because after reading those founding documents, especially the Declaration of Independence, where it says all men are created equal, the first time I actually sat down and critically thought about it, I'm like, there was so much cognitive dissonance, because if they really believe that, why would slavery not be abolished immediately? Why would there not be equal rights for men and women? And it just shows to me how divine the founding of America was, because those principles that came from God, basically, were set forth in those founding documents, but we didn't really wake up to the reality of what those words mean until, the years passed, and it created a place where that liberty could flourish for everyone. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting.
One of the more interesting things that I reached a conclusion on was America set the pace, not the pace, that's the wrong word, set an example for the rest of the world in a unique set of ways. Number one was we were unique in world history in basically saying to another nation, we are now free of you. We're going to create our own nation. And that's what the Declaration of Independence was. It was basically a letter to King George saying, we're going to declare our independence, and these are the reasons why.
He got broken up with. It's like we broke up with him.
Yeah, exactly.
Dear John letter.
Painful. It was a very painful breakup. But what you said, Jackson, is so true that one of the things that America proved, and has proven for 230 some odd years, is that you can have a nation where natural rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, which the founders understood to mean the right to private ownership and the fact that you get to keep that which you have honestly earned. These are what we deem natural rights, correct?
Yeah.
They prove that you can have a nation that can protect those natural rights and yet still be governed. And you may think, well, that's pretty evident, but in world history, it is absolutely unique. The concept of natural rights was discussed and written about in England for decades and decades before the American Revolution. But the premise always was, is if you say to people, you have the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, you can't be governed. You're going to be there's going to be anarchy. America proved to the contrary. And it was very unsettling to the aristocracy in Europe and the rest of the world. So much so that, 100 years later, Abraham Lincoln, in his famous Gettysburg Address, ended up by saying that, we're proving that government of the people, by the people, for the people can work. And if the Civil War here in America proves otherwise, the rest of the world, those monarchs in Europe who are watching the American Civil War with such hope that we will fail, we got to prove them wrong. That's what it was all about. So, can I make one other point?
Yes, please.
The American Revolution failed. Some people would suggest, what I would like to talk about for just a second is what would have happened in America had the American Revolution failed. And some have suggested that the British would say, oh, well, American cousins, you gave it your best shot. You lost, let's just go on and be a happy family. That's not what would have happened. About 30 years before the American Revolution, there was a rebellion of Scottish royalty. It was called the Jacobite Revolution.
Okay.
And it had some amazing success for a few months, and then it was ultimately squashed by the British. And the question is, again, this was just 30 years before the American Revolution. What happened to those people who had rebelled, the Jacobites? People who were trying to reestablish a Catholic king in England. All the leaders were executed. A number of them were taken to London, tried, and they were drawn and quartered, which is a very gruesome way of execution. All those who participated, the soldiers, were either executed or imprisoned to be tried, and most of them died while in prison waiting trial because of the conditions of captivity. Their property was confiscated. The Church of Scotland was put under the thumb of the Church of England. There was a very, very harsh punishment. Well, if they did that to the Jacobites, what do you think they would have done to the Americans? All of the leadership would have been executed. My surmise is that Thomas Jefferson and Madison and John Adams and George Washington probably would have been taken to London, tried, drawn and quartered. The Americans who had participated in the revolution, the soldiers, probably would have all been executed or again imprisoned. They probably, those who did not die by execution or dying while in prison, would have been sent to the West Indies as indentured servants, or perhaps to Australia. The infrastructure of America would have been destroyed. The churches here in America would have been under the jurisdiction of the Church of England. And those of us who can trace our ancestors back to the American Revolution, all those members of the sons of the American Revolution, and the daughters of the American Revolution, we may never have come to be, because all of our posterity would have been either executed or exported to some other part of the world. And the America that evolved thereafter would have been, in my estimation, it would have been probably landed aristocracy. England had this unique system that only the oldest son could inherit property in England. It always created problems with the younger sons. Well, King George easily could have said to those younger sons, I'll give you X number of acres in North Carolina or Massachusetts, and you can go and be the landed gentry of this new America under the thumb of Great Britain. We would have been governed out of London. it would have been, American history would be entirely different than what it is today.
I agree. I think one other thought that, as you were talking, it reminded me of a conversation I had with some friends the other day about how unprecedented World War II was in the way that America handled it, where we get into World War II after Pearl Harbor, we're fighting in the Pacific and on the European fronts, and in the end, America, with the help of America, and obviously the Russians played a big role as well, toppling the Nazi regime and winning World War II. And in world history, when countries win, they then conquer and rule those areas. And what America did was they helped build up, gave back the sovereignty of those countries, and allowed them to continue to rule as independent countries. And that is unique. That didn't, throughout world history, you win wars, that's now in your control. And I think that there is something so special, and there's a quote that I love that says, America is great because she is good. If she ever ceases to be good, she will also cease to be great. Are you worried about that at all as you see where America is going in terms of its morality and in terms of of its culture and view of its own history? Are you worried that we are going to cease to be great because we're ceasing to be good?
Well, there's a great quote that I believe it was George Orwell who said that those who control the past control the future, and those who control the present control the past. As we see our American history being altered, as we see it, the good things about America being hidden, strenuous efforts to undermine faith in America, that does undoubtedly alter the future of America. There's something unique about a society where we're self-governed, and that is we have got to have an appreciation for the goodness in our history in order for us to have faith in our future. Your observation about World War II, I would just add this to it. At the end of World War II, America had a weapon that no one else in the world did, the atomic bomb. If the United States was an evil nation, they could have said to Russia, we will bomb your cities unless you subject yourselves to us. We want all of your wealth. They could have done that to any nation on earth.
Could have taken over the world.
Could have taken over the world
It's
with
true.
the simple threat of using the atomic bomb as we had used in
Hiroshima,
and Nagasaki. But we didn't, because this is a good nation. Your observation about the history of nations conquering is important to understand too, because there's great criticism today about the way we treated the Native Americans. It is common for people to feel guilty about the fact that Native Americans lost wars, battles, and thus America settled the West primarily, but really the rest of the world as it did. Simple fact of the matter is, and it was Thomas Sowell, who is a great American, who made the observation. He said that, and I can't quote it exactly, but he said the Native Americans who lost to the American Western pioneers and so on, they lost the battles, but they did not necessarily think that was evil, because they themselves had been a warlike people. They had conquered. The history of Native American conquering other Native American tribes is pretty well documented, and almost all those major tribes, the Apaches, the Comanches, even the Iroquois, and so on, they had all conquered some other Native American tribe to establish themselves in the territory that they then had. Again, they didn't think it was evil. It was just the way it was. If you win the war, you get to keep the people, you get to keep the land. There was a period in world history, though, where that changed. This was known as was the Law of Conquest. It was actually accepted in international law as a principle. If you won a war, you got to.
It's now yours.
It's now yours. Yeah. It was when the United States was asked to enter World War I, and Woodrow Wilson basically said, if we enter on the side of the Allies, we do so understanding that you are going to abandon the idea that if we win against Germany, that you, France and Great Britain, get to rule Germany. We will only enter the war if you will abandon the law of conquest as an international principle, international law principle. Yeah. And for a period of time, that's, as you suggested a minute ago, that's why we didn't keep control of Japan or Germany at the end of World War II, because we, America, stuck to our principles that we are no longer going to follow the law of conquest. But as we can see in, for example, Russia invading Ukraine now, the norm is being restored. The norm throughout world history of if we conquer, we win, we get you. We get your land, we get your control of your people. So it's just been a very brief period of time, again led by America. That law of conquest has been abandoned as an international principle.
I didn't know that about World War I.
Yeah.
It's cool.
And also, it's just a bad idea, too, to try to conquer the world. You're just asking for more wars and revolutions, right? My question that I have for you, Judge, is our future. What lies in wait for us if we continue down this path of trying to demonize our history and to break away from the principles that founded this nation? What lies in wait for us if we continue down that path?
World history teaches us, as I've already said, that tyranny, rule by a tyrant, is the norm throughout world history. We are unique in world history. In fact, another quote that I'm very fond of was by a guy named Walter Williams, who was a professor at George Mason University. Excuse me. But he said one day in the future, historians may look back at this rather unique period in world history where, for a very brief period of time, only by a handful of nations were people allowed to govern themselves. And that is, I think, the answer to this very good question you ask, that if we do not keep hold of our historical goodness, and if we do not hold to those principles that made this nation great, the greatest in the history of the world in my estimation, that we will lose it. We will prove to those who came before and those who came after that people can't govern themselves, that you have to have a master of some sort, whether it be a king, a czar, an emperor, whatever you may title it. That's what I fear, but I have hope. I still retain hope that, and one of the reasons why is because God loves America. I firmly believe that America is a result of God-affected events in world history, and we as a nation have survived because of God's love for America, because of what we represent. And as long as we are worthy of that love and live up to the principles that God gave us, then we're going to be okay. But if we do abandon those principles that God expects us to live under, then we have nothing but a dark future.
I couldn't agree more. And what would you say to those who are watching, who are maybe a stay-at-home mom that are taking care of 3 kids, and they see what's happening in America, and they're like, how do I help? What difference can I make? What do you say to the person who's watching who just is working some job that has nothing to do with America or affecting change in the culture? What can they do on an individual level to help steer the ship in a better direction?
It's an excellent question, and I wish there was an easy answer. Number one, they owe it to themselves and to their family and to their children in particular to be informed, to care enough to read and listen to those who expound truths. Secondly, I think they have to be very, very careful what their children are being taught in schools. We know that a great deal of the misinformation, disinformation, and the altering in our nation's history is happening in the public education system. And I think it is incumbent on parents and grandparents to make certain that their children are in fact receiving the truth in school. They need to vote, they need to run for office, they need to support those good women and men who still believe in the principles that made America great, and make certain that they are in fact making the decisions for the future.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned reading books, and I think it's so funny. Like, as we walk into your office here, there's a lot of books, but a lot of big books that, I feel like for a lot of people would be hard to read. And I look around today and I see just the hugest detriment to society of the culture of like scrolling on social media, just watching mindless media and content. Going to like people's houses here in like 50 years, you're not going to see books on their shelves. I don't know what you'll see, but there's just a lack of people being invested in filling themselves with good content, with good books and information, to be able to actually be informed of why these things are so important.
I think the cheapening of if you don't have to do anything to earn a certain type of knowledge, it might not be good knowledge. And I think that most of the stuff that people are consuming online, which the majority of it, I would say, is kind of that revisionist history that America is a bad place, that it's still a bad place, and that we need to have another cultural revolution in order to change it to something better, kind of like this utopian dream. And I guess a call that I would have to everyone else is take the time to find the hard answers to hard questions. And I mean, you took a lot of time researching and wrote a whole book trying to find the answer of what if America never existed. Would the world be better off or would it not? And I think that based on what you said, you found out that it wouldn't. I want to leave it to you here before we wrap up, and then I have a parking ticket that I'd like you to help me out with if you could. Just kidding. But I want to leave with one final question to you to share with everybody listening. Judge Ted Stewart, why do you love America?
I love America because I have been extremely blessed to be born and raised in this country. I'm one of 10 kids who grew up on a dairy farm in Cache Valley. Went to a high school, my graduating class had 43 students in it. It was a very poor community, but it was a great community. And to go from that background to where I have the opportunity to serve where I do as a federal judge, I think is an example of what can happen in America, and probably only in America. My entire family has been blessed with opportunities that are unique to America. And among other things is the blessing of practicing the religion that I do without it being subjected to government oversight or interference, the opportunity to have public service as part of my family's heritage. Very few nations is that allowed. And so it's just from my own life and the things that have happened to me that have helped me to know why I must love America and why I am so genuinely blessed to have been born in this land.
Awesome.
Well, couldn't have said it better myself. Well, maybe I could have, but
yeah. Well, thank you.
You're paid to do it.
Well, thank you so much, Judge Stewart. We appreciate you inviting us to your beautiful office and sharing this amazing wisdom. And where can people buy the book? What's the name of the book if people are interested in knowing more? And where could people find it?
On Amazon.
Okay.
Yep.
Amazon. And what's the name of it again?
A World Without America. What would your life be like if the American Revolution had failed?
Epic. So if you're interested in this subject, you can buy that on Amazon. We'll put the link in the description. Thank you so much for watching the Why I Love America podcast, or listening, I guess. There's people listening. And until next time, God bless America.